1. Prologue. The Letter in the Storm. Rain poured down in torrents over the old tiled roofs of St. Mary Mead. In her small room, lit only by the glow of a single oil lamp, Miss Marple sat quietly darning a woolen glove when a sudden, urgent knock rattled the door. On the threshold stood a trembling messenger boy, drenched to the bone, clutching an envelope sealed with red wax. He handed it over with shaking hands. Inside was a single, hastily written line, the ink jagged as if scrawled in desperation. "Miss Marple, please come to Netherfield at once. A death has occurred, and it cannot be an accident." Netherfield, the ancient manor hidden amidst desolate fields, home to the Fairfax family for generations. A house remembered for lavish parties, endless corridors, and the solemn stares of ancestral portraits peering out from the shadows. Now it had become the scene of a mysterious death. The victim was none other than Sir Reginald Fairfax, the stern and formidable patriarch. His body was found at the foot of the great spiral staircase in the library. The candles around him had been snuffed out. His pocket watch lay far from where he fell, and the oak banister bore deep scratches as though someone had clung to it in a final desperate struggle. The local police dismissed it quickly, an accident, a careless fall in the dark. But something was wrong. Servants swore the candles had been burning only moments before. One of the children insisted they had heard raised voices from the library, just before silence fell. And in Sir Reginald's private journal, the last page held a chilling, unfinished line. "I know who is plotting." Miss Marple folded the letter gently, her eyes thoughtful. The wind moaned against the window panes, carrying with it the whisper of Netherfield. Someone in that house knew the truth and was hiding it. Was this truly an accident, or a perfect crime, staged in shadows, amidst shelves of books and secrets? Once more, Miss Marple would step into a web of lies, hidden fears, and a mystery only her sharp eyes could unravel. Chapter 1. Netherfield Manor and Shadows of the Past. The rain had not yet dried from the hedgerows when Miss Marple's carriage turned through the wrought iron gates of Netherfield. Mist clung to the grounds like a curtain, shrouding the old manor in a pale, uneasy glow. The building itself rose grim and impressive, ivy binding its walls as though nature sought to cage the secrets inside. Miss Marple stepped down lightly, handbag clasped, her keen eyes sweeping across the estate. She noticed the cracked stone at the base of a tower, the faint discoloration where ivy had been hastily trimmed, and a shutter that hung slightly ajar despite the damp morning. Houses, like people, told their own stories, and this one seemed reluctant to speak. The butler, Pritchard, greeted her with the mechanical stiffness of long service. His bow was correct, but his hands trembled ever so slightly as he ushered her into the hall. "Miss Marple, madam, if you would come this way." The hall was cavernous, lit by a single chandelier whose candles still smoked from having been recently extinguished. Portraits of Fairfax ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes following every step. Miss Marple felt the weight of history pressing down from the oak beams above and the cold stone below. Lady Eleanor Fairfax descended the great staircase slowly, her black gown trailing like a shadow. Her composure was admirable, but the paleness of her face betrayed sleepless nights. She extended her hand with a tremor. "Miss Marple, you cannot know how grateful I am. I would not have disturbed you, but..." Her voice faltered. "They say it was an accident. I cannot believe it." Miss Marple inclined her head. "The truth rarely minds being examined, Lady Eleanor. Perhaps you might show me the place where it happened." But before the widow could reply, a tall man appeared in the doorway. Charles Fairfax, the eldest son. His expression was sharp, his tone brusque. "This inquiry is unnecessary. The inspector has already ruled it a fall. My father was old, stubborn, and preferred candlelight to proper lamps. It was bound to happen." Lady Eleanor's eyes flashed. "Your father was careful. He knew those stairs as well as the back of his hand." Behind Charles slipped Beatrice, the daughter. She was pale, fragile, and looked at Miss Marple with a mixture of hope and fear. I don't think it was an accident either," she whispered, but her brother silenced her with a glare. Then came Edward Ashworth, the cousin, smiling too broadly. His jacket was worn, his charm overpolished. A dreadful business, yes, but surely we mustn't prolong grief with suspicion. Miss Marple, an honor, of course. My uncle valued peace above all. Miss Marple's eyes flicked from one face to another. She had seen such families before, each expression a mask, each silence more revealing than words. She offered nothing but a gentle smile and turned back to Lady Eleanor. "Perhaps you would take me to the library staircase?" They crossed the hall. The air grew colder as they approached the west wing. The spiral staircase coiled downward like a wooden serpent, elegant yet treacherous. Miss Marple paused at the top step, observing. The runner was neatly pinned with brass rods, but one rod was slightly bent, as though jarred by sudden force. A candle sconce on the wall was empty, its twin still bearing a stub whose wick was pinched flat. On the polished oak banister, just where a hand might clutch in panic, was a pale scratch. "Sir Reginald was found below," Lady Eleanor whispered. "The police say he slipped." Miss Marple bent, peering closer at the banister. Slips are clumsy things. This mark, however, is sharp, made by something pressed hard. A ring, perhaps, or a chain. She looked at Lady Eleanor. "His watch, where was it found?" "3 steps down near the wall?" "Odd, since he always wore it on a chain," Lady Eleanor said. Miss Marple nodded. "Odd indeed. A fall does not usually remove a watch before the body lands." Charles gave an impatient snort. "You make too much of trifles." "Trifles," Miss Marple said mildly, "often make up the sum of the truth." At the foot of the staircase, chalk still marked the outline of the fallen man. Nearby, Miss Marple spotted a faint crescent of wax tucked in the angle between wall and stair. She bent and touched it with her gloved hand. "Someone snuffed a candle here, quickly, recently." The silence that followed was heavy. Beatrice looked away. Edward adjusted his cuffs. Lady Eleanor's breath caught. Miss Marple straightened, leaning on her stick. Accidents seldom arrive with such careful preparation. "Tell me, Lady Eleanor, did Sir Reginald mention any changes he planned?" The widow hesitated, then lowered her gaze. "He spoke of his will. He meant to alter it, but he had not yet told us how." Behind her, Charles stiffened. Edward's smile faltered. Beatrice clutched her hands so tightly her knuckles whitened. Miss Marple noticed each reaction, tucking them away like clues in a puzzle box. "I see," she murmured. "A household of many doors then, and some perhaps better locked than opened." She allowed Lady Eleanor to guide her back into the hall, though her mind lingered on the staircase, the extinguished candle, and the scratch on the rail. These were not the marks of chance, but of intent. Someone in Netherfield had guided Sir Reginald toward his fall. As she mounted the guest corridor with Pritchard at her side, Miss Marple glanced out a tall window. Beyond the gardens, the ornamental lake gleamed dully in the mist. Its surface was smooth, but for a single ripple trail leading into the reeds. She stored it away. In her chamber, she unpacked slowly, then drew the letter with the red seal from her bag. The handwriting was not Lady Eleanor's nor Charles's bold hand. It was finer, uncertain, written in haste. A plea from someone inside the house who feared the truth would be buried. Miss Marple set it on the table beside her and folded her hands. Netherfield was a beautiful mask, but beauty never lasted. Behind it, the truth waited, quiet but insistent. And Miss Marple had come to listen. Chapter 2. Death on the Spiral Staircase. The morning after her arrival, Miss Marple descended to the breakfast room, where the Fairfax family gathered under a pall of uneasy silence. Silver coffee pots gleamed, toast racks stood untouched, but no one ate. Lady Eleanor sat upright at the far end of the table, a porcelain figure etched with sorrow. Charles read the newspaper but turned no pages. Beatrice toyed with a teacup, her eyes downcast. Edward hummed tunelessly as though to drown out the tension. The door opened. Inspector Graves entered with his notebook. He was a broad man with thick brows and a manner that preferred conclusions already tied in neat bows. "Good morning," he said brusquely. "I'll need each of you to repeat your account for the record. Routine, nothing more." Charles gave a sharp nod. Lady Eleanor's lips thinned. Miss Marple, who had been offered a seat at the far side of the table, adjusted her spectacles and folded her hands, listening with quiet intensity. Reconstructing the night, Inspector Graves cleared his throat. Sir Reginald retired to the library shortly after 10 o'clock. He was found dead at 11:30 by the maid Ellen, who raised the alarm. The death is consistent with a fall. That is our working assumption. Miss Marple's voice, gentle but firm, carried across the room. Forgive me, Inspector, but perhaps you might walk us through the exact circumstances. Sometimes the smallest details, when spoken aloud, reveal their own meaning. The inspector frowned slightly, but gestured for them all to follow. They returned to the west wing. The spiral staircase rose in its elegant curve, daylight now streaming through mullioned windows, revealing dust motes spinning in the air. Sir Reginald's body was found here. Graves pointed to the flagged stone at the base. The chalk outline had been rubbed faint by passing feet, but the shape lingered. His head struck the stone. Death would have been instantaneous. Lady Eleanor's voice was strained. And yet, Reginald was cautious. He never hurried these stairs. Charles cut in. Mother, you must accept facts. Father was old, his eyesight failing. It was inevitable. Perhaps, Miss Marple murmured, her eyes sweeping upward, but inevitability seldom leaves scratches in oak. All eyes turned to her as she touched the banister. The thin gouge, pale against the polished wood, caught the light. Made by something hard-pressed suddenly. A ring, or a button, perhaps. You see how fresh the wood appears? It is not yet darkened with age. Inspector Graves scribbled reluctantly in his notebook. They climbed the staircase. Halfway up, Miss Marple paused, crouching near a sconce. She indicated the empty bracket. One candle missing, she said softly. Yet wax dripped below. Someone snuffed it quickly. Note the flat wick. Graves grunted. Perhaps the maid forgot to replace it. Or perhaps, Miss Marple said, darkness was required. At the landing, Beatrice gasped. Look! A small object had been overlooked near the skirting board. A brass chain link, twisted and broken. Miss Marple bent and picked it up delicately. From a watch chain, perhaps? She asked. Lady Eleanor's hand trembled to her lips. Reginald's. He always carried it. Curious then, Miss Marple murmured, that his watch was found not here but some steps below, as though removed before the fall. Inspector Graves shifted impatiently. You're suggesting robbery? No, Miss Marple said, straightening, her eyes unreadable. I suggest intent. The family's accounts back in the library. Inspector Graves began taking statements. Charles Fairfax spoke first, his tone clipped. I was in the garden between 10 and 11. I often walk there at night. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap. And yet, she said mildly, your boots show no sign of dew, though the lawns were wet last night. Charles flushed. I changed them. Of course, Miss Marple said, returning to her stitches. Beatrice gave her account in a wavering voice. I was in my room. I heard something. Footsteps, perhaps, then a cry, but I cannot be sure. Miss Marple looked up. A cry, dear? You are quite certain? Beatrice nodded, then faltered. Or perhaps only the wind. I was frightened, that is all. Edward Ashworth leaned back in his chair, careless. I was sketching in my chambers. The storm inspired me. My door was locked. Yet the maid tells me, Miss Marple said gently, that she delivered coal to your fireplace at 10:30. She found the door ajar. Edward's smile stiffened. Then she misremembers. Finally, Lady Eleanor spoke, her composure brittle. I retired early. My room is far from the library. I heard nothing until the alarm. Miss Marple regarded her kindly, but did not press. A widow's grief was its own labyrinth. The maid's discovery. Ellen, the young maid, was summoned. Her eyes were wide, her hands raw from scrubbing. I came to fetch the silver tray, ma'am, she whispered. The library door was half open. I called, no answer. Then I saw him at the bottom of the stairs. The candlelight was gone, only shadows. Had you seen anyone enter before that? Miss Marple asked gently. The girl shook her head. Only, I thought I heard voices earlier, low, like arguing, but I dared not linger. Inspector Graves dismissed her. Unreliable. Servants imagine things. Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-loop. Servants, Inspector, often notice what their masters would rather ignore. A map of shadows. When the questioning ended, Miss Marple remained behind in the library. She paced slowly, her eyes not on the shelves but on the floor, the candle sconces, the arrangement of chairs. She noted a volume pulled slightly from its row, as though taken and hastily replaced. She brushed her hand across its spine. Tennyson's In Memoriam. The gilt was fresh, newer than the others. On the writing desk lay Sir Reginald's diary. The last entry stopped mid-sentence. I know who plots. The ink blotted, the pen dropped. Miss Marple touched the blot. Dry now, but only just before his death, she walked to the stairs again, gazing upward into the spiral. The shadows pooled like secrets waiting to be uncovered. She closed her eyes briefly, reconstructing the night. A meeting arranged. A candle snuffed to darken the landing. A struggle at the rail, leaving a scratch. The watch torn free before the fall. Then the silence of stone. A quiet resolve. That evening, the family dined together in strained civility. Forks scraped, conversation stumbled. Miss Marple sat silently, her mind weaving fragments together. She thought of Charles's dry boots, Beatrice's shifting story, Edward's careless lies, and Lady Eleanor's silence. She thought of the broken chain link, the extinguished candle, the diary's final line. As the grandfather clock told the hour, Miss Marple's gaze rested once more on the staircase beyond the dining hall. It stood waiting, patient as death itself. No, this had not been an accident. Someone within Netherfield had orchestrated every detail, and sooner or later, the truth would betray them. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, her expression calm. Accidents, she murmured softly to herself, rarely require so much preparation. Chapter 3. The Fairfax Family, Secrets Within. The rain had lifted by the time Miss Marple began her quiet explorations of Netherfield. The manor, scrubbed by storm and sunlight, gleamed across the lawns as if to proclaim innocence. But to Miss Marple, houses often resembled people. The more immaculate the facade, the more secrets waited behind the curtains. She asked, ever so gently, to be introduced to the family. And one by one, the Fairfaxes revealed themselves. Lady Eleanor. The widow received Miss Marple in the morning room. The light fell kindly on her pale face as she poured tea with the composure of long habit, but her hand shook when she replaced the silver pot. My husband was a man of certainty, she said. He disliked hesitation, even in others. That was both his strength and his cruelty. Miss Marple listened, watching steam rise from her cup. He intended changes, I think. Lady Eleanor's lips pressed thin. He meant to alter his will. For the school, the church, the village poor. His conscience had turned outward. And inward? A pause. Toward Charles, Lady Eleanor admitted softly. Reginald believed our son needed restraint. He spoke of reducing allowances. He thought it would teach him discipline. Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. Discipline is rarely welcomed as a gift. Lady Eleanor's gaze dropped. No, and yet, he had already written to the solicitor. The china shepherdess on the mantel gleamed under the light. Miss Marple noted a faint smear of wax on its bonnet ribbon, an intrusion that did not belong. Charles Fairfax. She found Charles in the gunroom, polishing a rifle with the determination of a man who needed something solid beneath his hands. His expression was handsome, but lined with irritation. You want my movements, I suppose? He said before she asked. I told the inspector I was walking in the gardens alone, thinking. Miss Marple's voice was mild. The lawns were wet, yet your boots at breakfast were perfectly dry. He stiffened. I changed them. Of course, she said, letting the silence speak. His shoulders lifted defensively. My father wanted me treated like a child. He never trusted me to manage the estate. He meant to lock up money that was rightfully mine. You understand what that means for a man's reputation? I understand disappointment, Miss Marple said quietly. It makes people hasty. His jaw tightened. He said nothing more, but Miss Marple had learned enough. Beatrice. In the music room, Beatrice's fingers hovered above the piano keys, trembling on a single note. She was delicate, bird-like, but her eyes were sharper than her manner suggested. I heard a sound that night, she whispered. Not a fall. A candle snuffed. It was distinct. Then silence. You told the inspector this? He dismissed it, said grief plays tricks. Grief may, Miss Marple said, but so do lies. The girl glanced down at her sleeve, tugging it lower. Miss Marple glimpsed a faint scratch along her wrist, fresh, raw, the kind made by wood under pressure. Her thoughts returned to the banister's pale gouge. Beatrice looked away. Father spoke of changes, of making me independent. It frightened Charles. He said it would disgrace us all. Independence, Miss Marple thought, is a dangerous promise to dangle. Edward Ashworth. The cousin's studio smelled of turpentine and wasted ambition. Edward greeted her with exaggerated cheer, but his eyes darted nervously toward a desk where a broken chain link lay half hidden under papers. I was in my room, working, he insisted. My door was locked. Locked? Yes, of course, I value solitude. Miss Marple tilted her head. And yet Ellen brought coal at 10:30. She said the door stood ajar. His smile slipped, then returned, brittle. The girl misremembers. Her gaze rested on the bent link, the sort that might belong to a pocket watch. Edward swept it into a drawer with forced nonchalance. A trinket, worthless. Sometimes, Miss Marple murmured, the broken pieces tell more than the whole. Mrs. Dunlop. The housekeeper's office was lined with ledgers, its air thick with starch and discipline. Mrs. Dunlop met her with brisk authority. This house is orderly, madam, she said. You'll find no negligence here. And yet one candle on the library landing was extinguished by hand, Miss Marple observed, not by draft. The woman's face barely shifted, but her pencil stilled. Servants light, they do not snuff. Someone else must have done it. Quite so, Miss Marple agreed. Gentlemen sometimes prefer shadows. For a moment their eyes locked, one keeper of order recognizing another. Then Mrs. Dunlop bent over her ledger again. Ellen. The maid was cornered in the service corridor, apron twisted in her hands. I heard voices, she blurted. Sir Reginald and a man talking sharp. Then another step, lighter, like a woman. And I smelled lavender. I swear it, miss. You did well to notice, Miss Marple said kindly. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise. The girl's relief was palpable. The library once more. By afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the scene of death. The spiral staircase rose, elegant and patient, awaiting confession. She traced the scratch in the oak again, then bent to the step where wax had pooled in a crescent shadow. Nearby, the faint polished scuff of a town shoe marred the paint. On the writing desk lay Sir Reginald's diary, his last words trailing off mid-sentence. I know who plots. The blot of ink told its own story. A pen wrenched from hand before the sentence could be finished. She opened the shelves. In memoriam, the maroon volume Beatrice had mentioned stood slightly proud. Its gilt edges were brighter than the rest, dust displaced. Inside, the flyleaf bore a faint wax stain, as if a note had once been pressed there. The book, the wax, the broken chain, the silence after snuffed candles. Each was a thread. And Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime unpicking tangles in both knitting and character, felt them tightening toward a pattern. Shadows of motive. By evening, she sat in the south garden with her knitting. The house seemed calm, but she heard the storm still crackling behind its windows. Charles, angry and ambitious, stood to lose his inheritance. Beatrice, timid yet desperate for independence, carried secrets she could not voice. Edward, drowning in debt, reached for money that wasn't his. Lady Eleanor, enduring but protective, feared more than grief. Mrs. Dunlop, loyal but watchful, concealed what servants often see. Every one of them had a reason to wish Sir Reginald's voice silenced. Miss Marple tied off her thread of yarn and glanced toward the west wing, where the staircase coiled like a question mark. She would ask them to gather again soon, over tea perhaps. She had learned that repetition was the enemy of liars. When made to repeat a tale, the careless stitch would always unravel. For now, she allowed herself one small smile. Families were like embroideries, neat on the surface, knots hidden beneath. And at Netherfield, the knots were beginning to show. Chapter 4, Testimonies and Contradictions. The following morning, Netherfield's silence felt heavier than the storm that had drenched it. Inspector Graves set up his inquiries in Sir Reginald's oak-paneled study, and Miss Marple, knitting needles resting quietly in her lap, was allowed a corner seat. She appeared the most inconspicuous presence in the room. But to those who knew her, such silence was a net stretched wide, ready to catch lies as they fell. 1. Ellen the maid. Ellen stood first before the inspector, twisting her apron. Her voice was thin but steady. "I lit the candles in the library at 9:30. Sir Reginald said he wanted them, not lamps. Mrs. Dunlop told me so. As I left, I heard voices. Sir Reginald and another man. Low, sharp words. Then, later, a lady's step in the corridor, light-footed, and I smelled lavender. It didn't belong there, sir. The library always smells of beeswax." Graves frowned. "Time?" 10:15. The church bell had just struck. "And then?" "When I returned with matches, the candle on the landing had gone out. Not blown, sir. Pinched." "Why didn't you mention this before?" "I told Mrs. Dunlop. She said not to chatter." Miss Marple's gentle voice broke in. "It's clever of you, Ellen, to remember a scent. Lavender can cling where eyes see nothing." The maid flushed with relief. 2. Mrs. Dunlop, housekeeper. Mrs. Dunlop entered next, formidable as a ledger. "My staff are accounted for," she declared. "I was in the scullery until 11. The fires were out. I saw to them myself." Graves produced a slip. "Lavender polish. Delivered 2 days ago. Yours?" "For the drawing room walnut. Lady Eleanor dislikes turpentine." "And you told Ellen not to chatter?" "I told her not to stand idle in passages," she said crisply. Miss Marple examined the ledger Mrs. Dunlop carried. Each entry was immaculate, except the last, where a drop of wax had hardened beside the word candles. Amber wax, not lavender. She spoke mildly. "Candles do tell their stories. Pools lean one way if a flame gutters, another if it's snuffed." Mrs. Dunlop's pencil resumed its tidy tapping, but her jaw tightened. 3. Charles Fairfax. Charles entered with a stiff swagger, his jaw set. "My movements? Simple. I walked the east lawn from 10 to past. I returned and found my father at the foot of the stairs." "Your boots were dry this morning," Graves countered. "I changed them. I have more than one pair, Inspector." Miss Marple, still knitting, observed, "Garden gravel clings to runners indoors. It's quite faithful that way." Charles's expression darkened. "Are we measuring dirt now while my father lies dead?" Graves ignored him. "Your father's will. He meant to reduce allowances." "That was his obsession," Charles said sharply. "To belittle me. He could not bear the idea that I might live without his purse strings." Miss Marple's eyes never lifted from her needles. "Impatience, Mr. Fairfax, is a heavy thing to carry upstairs." He turned away, lips pressed tight. 4. Beatrice drifted in pale as lace, hands folded tightly in her lap. "I couldn't sleep," she whispered. "I wandered toward the library. Then I heard it." She mimed a quick pinch. The sound of a candle snuffed. And then silence. A moment later, a thud. "You told the inspector a cry," Miss Marple said gently. Her eyes darted. Perhaps the wind, I don't know. Graves eyed the red mark half hidden on her wrist. How did you scratch yourself? Beatrice flushed. On the music stool. Graves made a note to check the stool. Miss Marple simply said, Stairs can leave their mark too, my dear. On wood and on skin. Beatrice shivered. 5. Edward Ashworth. Edward swept in with a painter's scarf and a careless grin. I was in my studio, he declared. Door locked, working. Locked? Graves asked. Yes, naturally. Miss Marple's tone was gentle. Yet Ellen says she brought coal to your fire at 10:30. The door was ajar. Edward faltered, then laughed too loudly. She mistakes me. She's a fanciful girl. Graves leaned forward. And this? He dropped the bent chain link on the desk, the one fished from Edward's drawer. Edward blanched. A trinket, worthless. It matches Sir Reginald's watch chain, Graves said flatly. Edward's smile collapsed. 6. Lady Eleanor. Finally, Lady Eleanor entered, composed in grief. My husband intended to alter his will. He quarreled with Charles. He spoke of trusts for the village. You retired early? Graves pressed. Yes, to my room. I heard nothing. But Ellen, still lingering, whispered from the doorway. Forgive me, my lady. But at 10 past, you were in the drawing room. I saw you as I covered the harp. Mrs. Dunlop bristled. The girl is mistaken. Lady Eleanor lifted a hand. Enough. Grief confuses hours. Perhaps it was later than I recall. Her handkerchief, as she folded it, bore the faintest golden stain of lavender wax. Miss Marple saw and said nothing. The spiral staircase again. When the interviews ended, the house emptied into uneasy silence. Miss Marple remained. She moved slowly along the spiral staircase, fingertips brushing polished oak. The fresh gouge gleamed pale against the banister. A splinter had lifted. Beatrice's wrist bore its echo. On the third tread, a pool of hardened wax glistened, its edge tilted as though snuffed by hand. She knelt. Near the riser, a polished smear gleamed black. Narrow. Not a gardener's boot, but the kind of town shoe Charles wore, or Edward on his nights in town. At the base of the stair, the watch had fallen far from Sir Reginald's body. Watches did not leap from chains. They were torn loose. On the desk lay the diary. The ink blot, fresh on the last line, still whispered, I know who plots. Threads in the fabric that night at dinner, the family ate in brittle silence. Forks scraped porcelain. Conversation fell in fragments. Charles drank too much claret. Beatrice picked at bread. Edward cracked a joke that died unanswered. Lady Eleanor barely touched her plate. From her quiet seat, Miss Marple let the fragments of evidence knot together. Charles, impatient, threatened by loss of inheritance. Beatrice, fragile yet hiding scratches and secrets. Edward, caught with a broken watch chain. Lady Eleanor, grieving yet evasive, lavender wax upon her handkerchief. Mrs. Dunlop, guardian of the house, a candle snuffer in her keyring. Every one of them had lied, in small ways, and each lie left a stitch showing in the embroidery. Miss Marple set down her knitting, folded her hands, and gazed at the spiral stair through the doorway. Accidents, she murmured to herself. Never need so many lies to explain them. Chapter 5, Clues in the Library, Part 1 Sao. The library at Netherfield was no ordinary room. It was the heart of the manor, a place of dust and dignity, with tall shelves rising to the plastered ceiling, heavy curtains muffling sound, and portraits glaring down from shadowed corners. It was here that Sir Reginald Fairfax had fallen to his death, and it was here Miss Marple knew that the truth must still linger. Late that afternoon, while the family nursed their grief in silence, Inspector Graves permitted a closer examination. He busied himself with notes and sketches, while Miss Marple, quiet as ever, wandered among the bookshelves with the unhurried gaze of one who noticed small things others overlooked. The spiral staircase wound down into the far end of the room. its iron rails cold to the touch, its steps polished by generations of shoes. It was from this staircase that Sir Reginald had tumbled. The banisters still bore the pale splinter where someone's hand had clawed in desperation. But Miss Marple's eyes did not rest on the obvious. She drifted instead toward the shelves nearest the foot of the stairs. There, a single book protruded from the row, a thick, leather-bound volume of Tennyson's poems. Not fallen, not misplaced, but drawn halfway out, as if tugged in haste or left deliberately. The dust upon its top edge had been disturbed, revealing a finger's track. "Curious," Miss Marple murmured. Graves looked up from his sketches. "A book out of place? Hardly conclusive, ma'am." "Perhaps not conclusive," she agreed softly, "but certainly deliberate. Books rarely move themselves." She leaned closer. Behind the pulled volume, a narrow gap yawned in the shadows of the shelf. Something pale caught her eye. She reached in carefully and drew out a glove, soft kid leather, creased by wear. A woman's glove, finely stitched, its edge dusted faintly with wax. Miss Marple turned it over in her hands. Not Ellen's coarse cotton, nor Mrs. Dunlop's work-stained hands. This glove belonged to someone accustomed to finer things. Lady Eleanor, perhaps, or Beatrice. Graves frowned. Careless loss or planted evidence? Sometimes, Miss Marple said, tucking the glove into a clean handkerchief. What is hidden tells more than what is left in plain sight. She bent lower. At the base of the shelf, where the candlelight had once stretched in wavering shadows, a small patch of hardened wax gleamed against the wooden floorboards. It had spilled in an odd way. Not the broad pool of a candle burning steady, but a sharp drop, tilted as though the flame had been suddenly snuffed. She touched it lightly with her knitting needle, which she carried habitually. The wax cracked. Its scent rose faintly. Lavender. The same polish Ellen had mentioned. The same perfume that had lingered on the stair. Miss Marple's eyes softened in thought. "Inspector," she said gently, "the candle near the stairs went dark. And here, another candle was quenched. Why snuff out the light when one needs it most? Unless secrecy was more precious than sight?" Graves scowled. "So you believe Reginald Fairfax was lured here?" "I believe," she replied, "that he was expected. The watch and the distance." At the center of the rug lay the faint impression where Sir Reginald's body had fallen. Beside it, Inspector Graves had already placed the shattered pocket watch, its chain snapped. Yet the watch itself had landed far from the body, almost by the desk. Miss Marple walked the distance slowly, measuring with her steps. Odd, is it not? A fall tears chains downward, not sideways. This watch was not flung by chance. It was pulled, wrenched from him before he fell. Graves rubbed his temple. Pulled by whom? That, Miss Marple said mildly, is the question you must answer. But the chain's broken link might tell us if we are willing to look closely. She examined the snapped edge again. The metal showed a faint smear, dark against its silver. Not rust, nor common dirt. Ink, perhaps, or polish. She wrapped the piece carefully in her handkerchief, her blue eyes thoughtful. The library's whisper. The air of the library carried its own stories. Old paper, polish, and the faint tang of extinguished wicks. Miss Marple closed her eyes a moment, letting memory stir. Ellen had spoken of lavender. Beatrice had spoken of silence broken by a snuff. Edward had lied about his locked studio, yet his trinket matched the broken chain. Charles's boots had no gravel. Lady Eleanor's handkerchief carried the wax. And all of them, in their turn, had reason to fear what Sir Reginald might have revealed. Miss Marple reopened her eyes. "Inspector," she said gently, "may I suggest that we not think only of who stood to gain from Sir Reginald's death, but of who feared most what might be discovered within these shelves?" Graves gave her a puzzled glance. She pointed to the half-pulled book. "Books do not betray themselves, Inspector, but men and women do." Miss Marple stood back, her knitting needles idle in her hand, and gazed once more at the staircase. Shadows stretched long in the room as the afternoon dimmed. Somewhere in this chamber, carefully disguised among wax stains, misplaced books, and a hidden glove, the truth waited. And she, with her quiet patience, would untangle it. The inspector, watching her, shifted uncomfortably. He knew by now the danger of underestimating the old woman with sharp eyes and soft voice. And Miss Marple, smiling faintly to herself, thought, "This library has not finished speaking." Chapter 5, Clues in the Library, Part 2-2. The light in the library had grown softer, the tall windows shaded with dusk. Inspector Graves tapped his pen against his notebook, muttering about candle wax and misplaced gloves. Miss Marple remained silent for a long moment, letting the stillness breathe. She had learned that truth often rose like steam when the air was left undisturbed. Her eyes drifted again to the glove she had wrapped in her handkerchief. The stitching was neat, but the wear at the fingers was distinctive. Miss Marple had seen it before, at tea that very morning. Lady Eleanor Fairfax, twisting her hands together as she tried to maintain composure, had revealed a glove missing from her pair. The tiniest thread of recognition tightened in Miss Marple's thoughts. But she said nothing yet. The echo of testimonies. "Inspector," she said quietly, "do you recall Charles Fairfax's account? He claimed to be walking in the garden during the time of death." "Pasha," Graves replied, scowling. "Yet the gardener swore he never saw him there." "Precisely. And Miss Beatrice spoke of hearing footsteps upon the landing. Yet when pressed, she changed her story, insisting it might have been wind." Graves nodded slowly. "And the housekeeper, Mrs. Dunlop," Miss Marple continued, "told us she kept the fire going in the kitchen all night. But the ashes in the hearth are cold and white. Fires that last are not white. They are black and clotted." The inspector's brows drew together. "So, which of them do you suspect planted themselves here in the library?" Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Perhaps more than one. Lies are like weeds. They grow in patches. And often one falsehood conceals another. Wax and shadows." She stooped near the wax on the floor, her fingers steady despite her age. "This candle," she said, "was extinguished suddenly. You see how the drops hardened in a splash, not a pool? Someone snuffed it out with haste." "But why?" Graves muttered. "Because light betrays," she answered, "and secrecy demanded darkness." She rose and looked to the spiral staircase, its coils looming in the gloom. Imagine Sir Reginald descending, candle in hand. Someone waits here, another candle already lit upon the shelf. A word exchanged, perhaps a confrontation. Then snuff, the flame dies, confusion and darkness. A shove, a wrench, a fall. Graves's pen scratched rapidly. "So you believe it was staged, not accident?" Miss Marple gave him one of her mildest smiles. "Accidents rarely require preparation." The watch chain. She drew out the broken chain of the pocket watch once more. Here is the greater puzzle. The watch did not fall with him. It was pulled free. "By whom?" Graves demanded. "Consider the testimonies. Edward Ashworth spoke of repairing trinkets in his studio, did he not? He boasted of his skill with delicate metals, and yet the chain shows a forced break, not the snap of age. You think Edward handled it? I think Edward knows more than he has confessed. A man who fails at art but succeeds in debt may find temptation stronger than loyalty. And this chain, smeared with ink, why ink? Unless handled by someone who had just been working with it." Her eyes flickered toward the desk where Sir Reginald had kept his journals. Several entries had been blotted, as though touched by fingers smudged with ink. The half-pulled book. She returned to the shelf. And then there is the book itself. Why pull it halfway? Not to read, it was left standing, but to conceal. Behind it was the glove. Who places a glove so carefully, unless they intend to hide it? Graves frowned. "Lady Eleanor's, you believe?" Miss Marple's tone was careful. "Lady Eleanor is not a woman to mislay such things. If she left it, it was not by accident. If another placed it, then it was with cruel intent, to shift suspicion." She tapped the spine gently. "And this volume, Tennyson's poems. Do you not recall Beatrice mentioning her fondness for his verses? She quoted lines nervously during her testimony. Her hand, too, might have drawn this book out. But her silence suggests she fears being connected to it. Graves muttered under his breath, clearly frustrated. Too many suspects. Too many motives. Miss Marple's weaving of threads. Ah, Miss Marple said softly. But threads, Inspector, are meant to be woven. Consider, Charles lies about his whereabouts. Beatrice changes her account of footsteps. Mrs. Dunlop conceals the truth about the fire. Edward has debts and fingers ink-stained. Lady Eleanor misses a glove, found here with wax. Graves exhaled sharply. So, all of them could be guilty. All of them could be involved, Miss Marple corrected. But only one hand pushed Sir Reginald, and that hand was careful enough to darken the room before striking. Hints of the method. She looked again at the staircase. Do you notice, Inspector, how smooth the banister is? Sir Reginald's nails scored one deep mark, but only one. If he had slipped unaided, he would have clawed along the way down. One mark suggests he was already falling when he reached for it. Thrust, not stumble. Graves leaned heavily on his pen. So we are dealing with a deliberate murder. Yes, and the library tells us so, if we are willing to listen. She turned to the window where twilight pooled like ink. Her voice lowered. This was not a crime of rage, Inspector. It was calculated. The glove hidden. The candle snuffed. The watch torn free. These are not the marks of accident. They are the marks of design. Graves swallowed. Then the killer is still among them. Miss Marple gave the faintest nod, and quite determined that we not discover the truth. Closing the circle. As they prepared to leave the library, Miss Marple glanced back one final time. The shelves, the wax, the glove, they seemed almost to speak, whispering of betrayal, ambition, and fear. Her knitting needles clicked once in her pocket. To Graves, it sounded like idle habit, but to Miss Marple, it was rhythm, reminding her that every stitch in a pattern had its place, and that even the loosest thread could unravel the whole. She murmured softly, more to herself than to the inspector. The library does not lie, only people do. And with that, she stepped into the hall, carrying the truth with her, though not yet the name of the hand that had turned darkness into death. Chapter 6, The Hidden Letters, Part 1. The library had emptied at last. Inspector Graves departed with his notes, muttering about interviews and alibis. The servants drifted back to their corners of the manor, whispering of curses and family feuds. Silence returned to Netherfield. Thick, uneasy silence, broken only by the faint creak of the spiral stair whenever the wind pressed against the house. Miss Marple remained behind. She had asked, ever so gently, that she be permitted just a few minutes more to tidy her observations. The inspector, long accustomed to the old lady's polite stubbornness, indulged her request. Now she moved slowly about the library, her keen eyes darting not at the obvious, candles, stairs, shelves, but at what others overlooked. A crime, she knew, seldom revealed itself in the violence of the act. It whispered, instead, from the quiet places where secrets were tucked away. The desk of Sir Reginald. Her attention lingered on the massive oak writing desk near the bay window. Sir Reginald Fairfax had been a man of pride, she recalled from village gossip, and his desk reflected that. Broad, polished, lined with neat stacks of correspondence, seals, and pens that gleamed even in the dimming light. But something jarred. The topmost drawer slid too easily, as though oiled only recently. Inside, envelopes lay in a precise row, but the paper smelled faintly of wax and dust. Oddly out of step with the well-aired room, Miss Marple's fingertips brushed the wood. An old man's desk, she murmured, ought to smell of ink and tobacco, not forgotten corners. She tapped lightly along the back panel. A hollow sound answered her. A hidden compartment. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She had seen such tricks before, at a vicarage where hymnals concealed gossip, in a cottage where biscuit tins hid rationed sugar. Men of Sir Reginald's stern nature often relied on hidden compartments, Pride demanded control. Secrecy demanded a lock unseen. She traced the join where wood met wood, pressing gently. A faint click rewarded her persistence. The back panel gave way, revealing a narrow recess. Inside lay a bundle of letters bound with faded ribbon. Dust clung to them, but not as thick as one might expect. Someone had touched these letters not long ago. Miss Marple drew them out with careful hands, as though handling relics. The ribbon broke with a soft snap. She began to read. The letters unveiled. The handwriting was unmistakably Sir Reginald's, angular, precise, with a soldier's impatience in every stroke. The earliest letters dated back nearly a decade, addressed to solicitors in London. They spoke of property, trusts, small bequests to loyal staff. But the later ones, those penned in the past month, burned with different intent. My decision is final. Too long have I indulged selfish quarrels among kin. If this estate is to mean anything, it must serve beyond the vanity of family. The hospital at St. Bartholomew's will receive the greater portion. Another letter followed. A draft of the new will is to be prepared without delay. None here must know of it until the papers are signed. My household is unreliable. Miss Marple set the paper down. The truth gleamed like a knife's edge. A motive in plain sight. If Sir Reginald intended to divert the estate to charity, the Fairfax heirs would lose everything. The lands, the funds, the influence bound within Netherfield's walls. For Charles, desperate to maintain his political aspirations. For Beatrice, whose fragile demeanor concealed unspoken desires. For Edward, drowning in debt. Such a change meant ruin. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Families did not kill for anger alone. They killed for loss. The loss of comfort, of pride, of inheritance. She remembered Lady Eleanor's trembling hands at tea, her insistence that Reginald never discussed finances with me. But the woman's eyes had flickered when the subject of wills arose. A flicker Miss Marple had not missed. The sudden knock. A sharp knock jolted her from thought. Beatrice stood timidly at the door, pale as parchment, her shawl clutched tightly. "Oh, Miss Marple," she whispered. "I thought everyone had gone. What are you doing here?" "Only admiring your late father's desk," Miss Marple replied smoothly, sliding the letters beneath her shawl. "So sturdy. Quite like him, I imagine." Beatrice hesitated, eyes darting toward the desk, then away. "Yes, sturdy." The girl lingered too long, her nervous hands betraying agitation. At last she fled, murmuring that she must rest. Miss Marple watched her go, heart tightening. The young woman's fear was genuine, but of discovery or of guilt? The old lady's reflection. Left alone again, Miss Marple sat in the high-backed chair by the desk, the letters heavy in her lap. The crime was no longer shrouded. A motive blazed clear as daylight. The will. Someone here at Netherfield had learned of Sir Reginald's intent. Someone had feared losing all and chosen to snuff out the threat before ink became law. Yet Miss Marple's mind lingered not only on motive, but on method. The candle snuffed, the glove hidden, the watch torn. These were acts of staging, of desperation perhaps, but also of cunning. And now, the letters whispered of the spark that lit it all. Inheritance denied, a whisper of danger. Outside, the manor's halls stirred faintly. Footsteps echoed. Too measured, too deliberate to belong to a servant. Someone had lingered, watching, waiting. Miss Marple folded the letters back beneath her shawl. Her instincts prickled. Secrets at Netherfield were not meant to be unearthed so soon, and whoever had cause to keep them buried might not shrink from silencing her too. With quiet dignity, she rose and slipped from the library, knitting bag tucked beneath her arm, shawl draped carefully. To the casual eye, she was only a frail spinster seeking her rest. But beneath the wool and lace, she carried the reason for murder. As she stepped into the dim corridor, she whispered to herself, "Now we know why. Soon we must learn who." Chapter 6, The Hidden Letters, Part 2-2. Morning crept into Netherfield with a reluctant sun, spilling pale light over stone walls and long curtains that smelled faintly of damp. The manor stirred like a restless sleeper. The clatter of trays in the kitchen, the murmur of maids sweeping the corridors, and, beneath it all, the hushed voices of a family who had spent the night in grief, or, for some, in fear. Miss Marple descended late to breakfast, shawl wrapped around her narrow shoulders, her knitting bag swinging lightly in hand. The bundle of letters lay hidden within, though not even Inspector Graves yet knew of their existence. She intended to keep it so, for now. At the long dining table, Lady Eleanor presided with brittle dignity, her teacup rattling faintly against its saucer. Charles lounged at her right, voice sharp as he scolded a footman for tepid coffee. Beatrice sat silent, eyes lowered to her plate, her fork untouched. Edward drifted in last, reeking faintly of spirits, his smile too bright for the hour. Each, Miss Marple thought, was performing. Some a mask of sorrow, others of impatience. But all masks crack under pressure. The letters weigh heavy. She listened, nodding politely at Charles's complaints, while her mind replayed the words she had read by candlelight. The hospital at St. Bartholomew's will receive the greater portion. None here must know until the papers are signed. Sir Reginald had been on the verge of finalizing the will. That meant only days, or perhaps hours, before his family learned their fortunes might vanish. Who had discovered it first? And who among them had both cause and courage to act? Subtle tells at breakfast. Charles leaned forward, stabbing a slice of ham. Father's affairs were stable. I've managed the ledgers myself last month. Nothing unusual there. Lady Eleanor's gaze flickered, barely, but enough for Marple to see. If Sir Reginald had concealed plans for a new will, Charles's words were not reassurance but ignorance. He believed he knew all, yet he did not. Beatrice at last raised her eyes. I dreamt last night of Father on the stairs, she whispered. He was trying to speak, but the candle blew out. Her hands trembled. Not merely with grief. Miss Marple remembered how the girl had hesitated in the library doorway, glancing toward the desk. Did she know of the hidden letters? Or only suspect? Edward forced a laugh. Dreams, dear cousin, mean nothing. Father was stubborn but hardly mystical. He drained his cup. What matters is the estate, and Mother will see it preserved. His smile lingered too long, his hand tightening around the porcelain until it threatened to crack. A man with debts does not joke easily when inheritance is at stake. Marple's gentle probe. Such a handsome family, Miss Marple said mildly, folding her napkin. It is fortunate Sir Reginald left matters in such order. A change so late in life might have caused distress. The effect was immediate. Charles's knife clattered against his plate. Lady Eleanor's lips pressed thin. Edward looked suddenly pale. Only Beatrice's eyes widened with something like fear. Hippo, Lady Eleanor said. Voice firm. Reginald believed in tradition. The estate passes as it always has. But Marple, knitting bag at her feet, knew the truth. Sir Reginald had not believed in tradition. Not any longer. The puzzle of opportunity motive, then, was plain. Greed, fear of ruin, dread of disgrace. But opportunity, that required sharper thought. The night of the death, the candle had been extinguished. The glove was left behind. The watch flung farther than a fall would allow. These details spoke of presence, not accident. She recalled Charles claiming he had been in the garden, yet a maid had glimpsed his figure in the library passage. Beatrice had said she heard footsteps but faltered when pressed. Edward had no clear alibi at all. And yet, opportunity favored not just presence, but knowledge. Who knew Sir Reginald would be in the library that night? Miss Marple pictured again the half-pulled book on the shelf, the dripped wax near the desk, the secret letters hidden within. Sir Reginald had been meeting someone there, willingly or not. Someone who knew enough to lure him into the heart of the house, where shadows cloaked betrayal. A private walk. Later that morning, Miss Marple took a slow walk along the south corridor, her cane tapping softly. She paused at the door of the library, now sealed until the inspector's return. Dust lingered, faint but telling. Her sharp eyes caught footprints, scuffed edges pointing inward. recent, though blurred by servants' passage. Behind her, a voice murmured. Beatrice stood at the window, pale as snow. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "do you believe Father fell?" Marple regarded her. "Do you?" Beatrice's gaze drifted downward. "He was changing things. I think Charles suspected. Edward, too. They were angry, very angry." Her words spilled like confession, but when Marple asked gently what she herself had known, the girl turned away, refusing to answer. The deduction forming, by afternoon, Miss Marple sat alone in her chamber, letters spread across the quilt like cards in a game of patience. She matched them against the family's words, the cracks in their stories. Motive, clear in every line of Sir Reginald's hand. A will rewritten, inheritance denied. Means a staged fall, with candle extinguished and stair rail marked by struggle. Opportunity, narrowed to those who knew of the will, or guessed it. Her needles clicked softly as she knitted, lips pressed tight. Yes, one among them had the knowledge, one had the desperation, and one had left a trail, not of sorrow, but of lies. Miss Marple folded the letters again, slipped them deep within her knitting bag. Her eyes, pale yet sharp, gleamed with quiet certainty. The noose was tightening around Netherfield, though none within its walls yet realized. Chapter 7. The Night Reenactment. Part 1-3. Calling the house to order. The storm that had haunted Netherfield all day loosened into a cold, needling rain by nightfall. At 10:30, at Miss Marple's request, the entire household assembled once more in the library. Lamps were lowered, curtains drawn. Only a single taper burned on Sir Reginald's desk. The grandfather clock, rewound and set to the hour of the tragedy, ticked a strict, almost judicial rhythm. Inspector Graves took his post by the door, notebook ready. Lady Eleanor sat very straight on the green damask settee, hands folded as if in church. Charles drifted toward the French doors with the air of a man who might bolt if given half a chance. Beatrice hovered near the first curl of the spiral, white-knuckled on the banister. Edward Ashworth arrived last, collar up, paint-scuffed cuff discreetly turned under, an artist's nervy elegance that tonight read as something else. "Thank you," Miss Marple said, voice mild, shawl pinned precisely. "We will let the room tell us what was done to Sir Reginald, and by whom." She lifted the taper. "First, the light. We will use one candle only, as that night. Note what the flame does to your eyes, the way it narrows the world and fattens shadows. Note also how the air moves." She walked from desk to stair, the taper cupped. Small tears of wax spooled and dropped in a dotted line. "Rooms keep memory," she murmured, "even after beeswax and brush. See here, Inspector, 3 older beads of wax that even the morning's cleaning could not reach. They mark a path to the staircase." Mrs. Dunlop, at the hearth, bristled. "We do keep this room proper, miss." "Immaculately," Miss Marple said kindly. "It's why any remaining sign matters." She set the taper back on the desk. The flame's tremor made stars in everyone's eyes. "Now your positions, please. Not as you wish them, but as you told Inspector Graves before and as the house has already suggested." They took their places with reluctant choreography. Lady Eleanor on the settee, Charles by the doors, Beatrice one step up the spiral, Edward half in the smoking room arch. Mrs. Dunlop angled toward the service corridor. Miss Marple moved among them as though settling pews. "Sir Reginald left the drawing room at 10:45, she said. "By 10:50, the house was as you see it now. At 10:54, the candle was quenched. At 10:55, the watch left Sir Reginald's person." She glanced at the clock. Its minute hand crept toward the old catastrophe. "We will walk through that quarter hour." She nodded to Graves, who produced a cloth-wrapped object and a piece of chalk. He marked 3 faint X's, one at the foot of the stair, one a pace beyond, one almost at the edge of the rug. From the bundle, he took an old nickel watch. Its chain caught the candlelight like a thin, sly snake. "A drop will fall close," Graves said, "but a throw will carry farther." Miss Marple stepped to the poetry case by the stair and ran a finger along a slim gap. She eased out a calf-bound Tennyson the width of a thumb, half pulled, just as it had been found. "A fussy man could not pass an ill-kept shelf," she said softly. "Whoever set this knew him." She pushed the book a fraction more. A muted click traveled the wood. No trick, just the old frame settling. Every eye went to the gap. "Attention captured," she said. "Balance compromised on a tight turn, in poor light." Beatrice blinked too fast. He wouldn't have climbed without the candle." "Which was here," Miss Marple said, petit soin, touching the desk's polished edge. "Or carried briefly this far." She lifted the taper again and, as before, walked to the stair, letting 3 new beads of wax fall between desk and runner. Side by side with the older dots, they made a faint constellation. Charles's mouth twisted. Dots of wax and poetry books. Really? "Patience?" Miss Marple said, with that small, undentable smile that had unnerved generations of St. Mary Mead's fibbers. She set the candle down, then laid her palm to the banister where pale scratches caught like thread in the light. "2 histories in this wood," she said. "Old Polish worn smooth by years, and new marks overlaid, shallow and fresh. And here," she took Inspector Graves's hand and guided it. "It is a little tacky." "Not beeswax," Graves muttered, frowning. "No, beeswax alone does not linger so," Miss Marple said. "A varnish, resinous, damar or copal perhaps. It softens under a warm hand, then retacks as it cools." Edward's tone tried for airy and landed short. "Painters are not the only people who own varnish, Miss Marple." "Of course," she said. "But painters do know how it behaves." Her eyes moved on. "Now this." From the shadowed gap behind a freestanding case, she drew out a small kid leather glove with a handkerchief. Right-handed, pearl button dulled. Candlelight found a faint sheen on the fingertips. "A glove can cap a flame without harm," she said. "And it will keep resin off one's skin while still letting a hand guide. Convenient if one wished to thrust a reaching man off his balance and then not smell of turpentine." Lady Eleanor stiffened. "Are we to be tried by innuendo?" "No," Miss Marple said gently. "By sequence." She pinched out the taper. The library collapsed into a hush that seemed to deepen the ticking. After a beat, Miss Marple's voice came from the darkness. Close, steady. "Now feel what you reach for without seeing. Listen to the house." A soft draw of breath, a faint shift of fabric. Somewhere rain combed the glass. Miss Marple struck a match. Fire blossomed. The candle took. The room's figures reappeared like returned spirits. "Our task," she said, back in her mild parish register, "is to see which of your accounts can live in this narrow corridor of time and physics." She looked to the clock. 10:50. "Sir Reginald leaves the drawing room," she pointed. "Lady Eleanor, remain seated. Charles, 2 steps only toward the doors, not yet outside. Beatrice, 1 tread up, just as you told the inspector. Mr. Ashworth, half in shadow there, you claimed the smoking room. Mrs. Dunlop, at your passage." They moved. The floor gave its small, telltale remarks. Miss Marple lifted the taper and began to narrate, gentle and inexorable. "Sir Reginald enters," she said, walking his path herself. "He sees the half-drawn book tuts. He reaches here for order." Her fingers brushed the calf spine. A presence stands at his shoulder. A second presence stands on the stair, close enough to hear, not close enough to touch. There are angry words, low, then sharp. Beatrice's throat worked. Charles looked as if he'd chewed a lemon seed. Miss Marple nodded once to herself, as if a small inner ledger balanced. "At 10:54, she said, "the candle is capped." She lowered the taper to the desk and, with a folded handkerchief, smothered it. The dark returned like a closing hand. The tick-tick-tick stepped forward in the silence. "In this dark," she said, "someone grips the rail here, at the fresh, tacky place, and slips. There is a cry, short. And at 10:55, When feet pound and voices rise, the watch is not dropped but thrown, to land far from where a fall would leave it and so confuse us. A beat. Then Graves flicked the watch sideways. It skittered fast to the chalked third X and lay there, a small moon caught. Miss Marple relit the candle. The library seemed smaller now and sharper. "Thank you," she said. "That is the shape. In part 2, we shall test each of your accounts against this shape and see which one breaks." Chapter 7, The Night Reenactment, Part 2-3, Colliding Accounts. The candle guttered faintly on the desk as Miss Marple looked from one face to the next. The room held its breath, the grandfather clock dictating each second like a judge tapping his gavel. "Now," she said quietly, "let us hear your voices against the room itself, one by one." She turned first to Lady Eleanor. "You said you were seated here, upon the settee, at the time your husband left the drawing room. You remained throughout?" Lady Eleanor inclined her head, pale as the pearl pins in her hair. "Yes. I do not wander the corridors at midnight, Miss Marple. Reginald went to fetch some papers, I believe. I remained where you see me now." Marple nodded. "And yet, if you were seated, you would have seen the candle carried toward the stair, or its sudden extinguishing. Did you?" Lady Eleanor's lips pressed together. "The candlelight was blinding. It throws odd shapes in this room. I cannot swear to what I saw." A silence gathered, thin but charged. Miss Marple did not press. She simply noted the tremor in the widow's hands as they folded tighter in her lap. Charles Fairfax was next. He leaned against the French doors, his chin raised. "You've already asked me this, Inspector. I was outside, smoking. The garden clears my head." Marple's blue eyes fixed him like pins. "But when I asked the maid, Clara, she recalled seeing you enter this room, not the garden, not 5 minutes before Sir Reginald's fall. Perhaps you stepped in, stepped out again?" Charles's jaw twitched. "Nonsense. She must have been mistaken. These servants are quick to chatter." "Perhaps," Miss Marple allowed. "But tell me, why is it that the garden's gravel showed no trace of your footfalls that night? The rain preserved every mark. Inspector Graves confirmed it." Charles's face hardened, and he looked away. The candle's flame showed sweat gathering at his temple. "Beatrice," Miss Marple's voice softened as she turned to the daughter. "You told us you were on the stair. A curious place to linger, is it not? Why stand there at all?" Beatrice's eyes darted toward her mother, then to the carpet. I had gone to fetch a book from the upstairs room and paused. The house was so quiet. Then I thought I heard voices. Father's voice, low but sharp, and another, muffled. I didn't want to intrude." Miss Marple leaned closer. "Voices that ended abruptly when the candle went out." Beatrice swallowed. "Yes." The old woman studied her, every blink, every tug at her sleeve. Then she looked to Edward Ashworth, who leaned half in shadow by the arch to the smoking room. He had been silent until now, his dark eyes restless. "And you, Mr. Ashworth, you claimed to be sketching at the time, in the smoking room." Edward's lips twitched in a crooked smile. "I had a notebook. I sometimes draw when sleep won't come. Artists' habits die hard." "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly. "And yet, you are acquainted with varnish, with resin. You know its smell, its tack. Do you recall telling Inspector Graves you spent part of that afternoon varnishing a canvas in your chamber?" Edward hesitated. "Yes, so what of it?" Miss Marple moved to the banister, ran her finger along the fresh scratches. The tackiness here was not candle wax alone. It bore the faint scent of resin, precisely what you had upon your hands. "Did you touch this rail, Mr. Ashworth?" Edward's silence was answer enough. His throat worked as though words stuck like thorns. Miss Marple shifted at last to Mrs. Dunlop, the housekeeper, who stood stiff-backed near the service door. "And you, madam, you swore you were in the kitchen that night, yet the hearth here had been cold long before midnight. If you were tending fires, why did the one in this room die so early?" The woman's eyes narrowed. "I keep many fires, Miss Marple. I cannot be in all places at once." "Of course not, and yet—" Marple gestured at the thin layer of cold ash in the grate, visible even now. This one was left neglected, perhaps because you were elsewhere at the crucial hour. Mrs. Dunlop's lips trembled, but she said nothing. Her eyes flicked to Lady Eleanor, then away. The silence stretched, taut as wire. The flame hissed, bent in a draft that no one admitted making. Miss Marple broke the stillness with her calm parish voice. "Do you see, Inspector? One by one, their words rub against the facts like ill-matched seams. Lady Eleanor sees nothing. Charles swears to the garden that left no trace. Beatrice hears voices but fears to name them. Edward's fingers carry the varnish that clings to the rail. And Mrs. Dunlop, so diligent, abandons the fire at the very hour when all else burns brightest. She let the list hang, like weight suspended over each head. And so," she concluded, "their stories collide not with mine, nor with yours, Inspector, but with the very bricks and polish of this room. The library itself is our truest witness." The grandfather clock chimed the quarter hour. The sound made each person flinch, as though struck by a hand unseen. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice did not. "In the end, it will not be what you claim," she said, "but what the house remembers." Chapter 7. The Night Reenactment. Part 3. The Revelation in Candlelight. The candles quivered as if they too sensed the weight of truth pressing in. Every face in the room was taut, drawn by the gravity of Miss Marple's quiet words. The spiral staircase loomed above, its rail gleaming faintly, the place where Sir Reginald had stumbled to his death. Miss Marple remained very still. Her eyes were not accusatory, not sharp like the inspector's. They were calm, observing, almost grandmotherly, and yet each word she spoke carried the chill of inevitability. Sir Reginald's fall was no accident. The library tells us so. See here? She gestured with her knitting needle toward the floor. Wax stains, where no candle should have dripped, and a glove, hidden deliberately behind the case. Someone arranged a meeting here that night. A murmur stirred, then died quickly under the inspector's stern glance. Miss Marple went on. One detail disturbed me above all. The scratches on the oak rail. They were recent, not aged by years of use. Fresh marks made by a desperate hand clinging on, and by another hand forcing it away. Beatrice gasped softly, her fingers clutching the fabric of her gown. Charles shifted uneasily, the brass buttons of his waistcoat catching the candlelight. Sir Reginald, Miss Marple continued, was lured here under pretext, perhaps summoned by a message, perhaps by a voice he trusted. The candles were set ready, the stage arranged. He came to meet his fate, though he did not know it. She turned her gaze toward Edward Ashworth, who stood near the shadows of the arch. Mr. Ashworth, the resin on the banister betrayed you. You had touched it after your varnishing work. You were near the scene when you claimed to be sketching elsewhere. Edward's mouth opened, then closed again. He raised a hand as if to protest, but no sound came. And Charles, she said gently, your garden alibi withers. The rain recorded no trace of your walk while a maid saw you here inside. You did not admit it because you feared suspicion. Yet I do not think you delivered the fatal push. Charles's face hardened, though relief flickered in his eyes. Then her gaze fell upon Lady Eleanor, regal and silent. You told us you saw nothing, but you were seated exactly where the candlelight falls. You could not have missed the figures moving on the stair, unless, of course, you chose to close your eyes. Lady Eleanor's lips parted, but Miss Marple raised a hand to forestall her. No, madam, I do not think you placed your husband on that floor. You had reason to fear him, yes, but no reason to act with such brute force. Your silence hides not guilt, but something else. Terror. The room seemed to tighten, all eyes darting from one face to the next, like gamblers waiting for the last card. Miss Marple's voice grew firmer. The truth lies here, in the glove, a left-hand glove, with traces of candle wax upon it, dropped in haste, concealed behind the shelves. It belonged not to Lady Eleanor nor to Beatrice. It is a gentleman's glove. Edward's, to be precise. Edward stiffened, his face blanching. You called Sir Reginald to meet you. You told him of your financial desperation, perhaps begged him for aid. He refused. The argument rose. Beatrice overheard it. And when he turned upon the stair, you extinguished the candle, struck at him, and forced his grip from the rail. He fell, helpless, onto the stone below. Edward shook his head wildly. "No, it wasn't like that. I didn't mean—" Inspector Graves stepped forward, but Miss Marple's voice cut through the chaos, low and steady. "You thought to stage an accident. The glove, the wax, the darkness, they were meant to hide your hand. But wax drips speak louder than lies, and scratches on oak tell stories that men would bury." Edward's shoulders sagged. His protests faltered, breaking into a half-sob, half-laugh. "He would have ruined me, changed his will, cast me out with nothing. I couldn't let him do it." Lady Eleanor covered her face with a trembling hand. Beatrice wept softly into her sleeve. Charles muttered a curse under his breath. Miss Marple only sighed, the sound weary but certain. Murder never ends where the culprit intends. It was not only fortune you destroyed, Mr. Ashworth. It was trust and family and the peace of this house. The inspector moved swiftly then, taking Edward by the arm, his voice clipped and official. "You'll answer for this in court. The evidence is clear." As Edward was led away, the room seemed to breathe again, though no one could quite lift their eyes to another. The candles sputtered lower, their wax pooling upon the desk. The last remnants of the staged accident now turned into irrefutable proof. Miss Marple lowered herself into the armchair near the fire, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze drifting to the high shelves where books loomed like silent judges. "It is curious," she said softly, "how often the smallest things, wax, a glove, a scratch, can unravel the grandest of lies." The clock chimed once more, steady and implacable. The truth had been spoken, and Netherfield's silence, at last, was the silence of release. Chapter 8, The Interrogation and Confession, Part 1-3, Shadows in the Cellar Room. The interrogation chamber beneath Netherfield's main hall was no dungeon, yet its atmosphere weighed heavy. Stone walls bore the damp chill of autumn, and a single lantern swung above the oak table where Inspector Graves sat, pen poised, notebook open. Across from him, Edward Ashworth slumped in a chair, his once carefully tailored coat now wrinkled and stained. His eyes darted between the inspector and the door as if already plotting escape. Miss Marple, small and composed, sat quietly at the edge of the room. She carried no authority in law, but Graves had long since learned her presence was invaluable. Where his sternness broke resistance, her calm attention loosened tongues. "Mr. Ashworth," the inspector began, voice clipped, "we've already established the circumstances, the glove, the wax, the scratches on the rail. It's damning." He leaned forward. "But we require the full sequence, every step, every word said between you and Sir Reginald that night." Edward's jaw tightened. "Why should I?" he muttered. "What difference does it make now?" Miss Marple's gentle voice filled the pause. "Because truth has a curious way of lessening its weight when spoken. Lies only grow heavier." Edward's gaze flicked toward her. For a moment, he looked like a child again, caught out in mischief, not a man accused of murder. He swallowed. "It began with the letters," he said finally, his voice low. "I knew of them before the rest of you. I'd heard whispers that Sir Reginald planned to change his will, to leave the estate, not to us, but to some blasted charity. I couldn't allow it." Inspector Graves scribbled quickly, his pen scratching. "So you confronted him?" Edward nodded. "Yes, I told him I needed help. Debts, you see, gambling debts." His laugh was hollow. Pathetic, isn't it? But he refused me outright. Said I had shamed the family long enough, that I deserved nothing. The inspector's brows drew together. "And that refusal drove you to murder?" Edward flinched. "I didn't mean to kill him. I only wanted to frighten him, to make him see I wasn't powerless. I thought if I pushed him to the edge, he'd yield." His voice cracked. But he stumbled. His hand slipped on the rail. And he broke off, staring at the lantern as if hypnotized by its flicker. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap, the only sound in the room for a long moment. Then she said, "You extinguished the candle first, didn't you? That explains the wax drips near the stair. You meant to plunge him into darkness, to disorient him." Edward's head snapped toward her, surprise etched across his features. He hadn't expected her to understand so precisely. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes, I snuffed it out. The darkness gave me courage, but when he slipped, I panicked. I tried to grab him back, but..." His voice failed, choked into silence. Graves pressed, relentless. "And the glove? Why was it hidden?" Edward looked down at his hands, fingers trembling. "It tore from my pocket when I caught the railing. I hid it without thinking, behind the shelf. Foolish. Everything I did was foolish." For the first time, there was no defiance in his eyes, only the weight of inevitability. Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone still soft but steady. "Edward, the truth is not foolish. It is painful, but it frees us from carrying shadows. Tell us everything. Only then will we understand, not just how, but why." The lantern flickered again, casting sharp angles across Edward's pale face. The silence stretched, thick as the stone walls around them. Finally, he drew a ragged breath. "Very well," he said. "If you want the whole of it, I'll tell you." Chapter 8. The Interrogation and Confession, Part 2, 3, The Full Confession. Edward's hands shook as he pressed them flat against the oak table, his voice gathering the brittle edge of desperation. "You must understand, I never wanted blood on my hands, not truly. All I wanted was a chance to breathe again, to live without the hounds of creditors gnawing at my heels. And Sir Reginald, he was the only one who could grant me that reprieve. But he refused me, cold as stone." He paused, running a hand through his hair, damp with sweat despite the chill of the cellar. I knew he intended to change the will. He'd spoken of it in half-finished remarks, and I overheard Lady Eleanor urging him to secure the family's legacy. But the truth was clear. He meant to leave the estate to strangers, to causes, not to us. Inspector Graves interjected, his tone sharp. "And that discovery sealed his fate?" Edward's mouth twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. "No, not at first. I tried persuasion, I even tried begging, but he called me weak, said I had squandered my chances, that I'd never be more than a parasite on the family name. That night, I told him I wanted to speak privately, away from the others. The library was perfect, quiet, hidden. He agreed, though reluctantly. Miss Marple, ever calm, adjusted the folds of her shawl and asked in her gentle voice, "So you arranged the meeting? That explains the half-pulled book and the wax on the floor. You set the scene yourself." Edward nodded, eyes fixed on the table. "Yes, I lit the candle by the stairs so it would seem harmless, welcoming. But in my pocket, I carried the glove and a small snuffer. When he arrived, we argued. Heated words, nothing more at first. Then I put out the candle. I wanted him to feel helpless in the dark. I thought perhaps a man of his age might bend under such fear." His breathing quickened. But he did not bend. He grew furious, struck at me with his cane. We struggled, his voice echoing through the library, though muffled by the heavy drapes. I grabbed his arm as he lunged toward the railing. The glove slipped from my pocket, caught on the shelf, and then it happened. The inspector leaned in. "You pushed him." Edward's head snapped up, his face pale but resolute. "No, that's not how it was. I swear it. I only meant to restrain him, to make him listen. But he stumbled. The wax made the steps slick. Yes, that was my doing, and his foot slid. He clutched the rail, but his strength betrayed him. I reached. I tried." His voice cracked, and he pressed his fist to his temples. "God help me, I tried to pull him back, but gravity claimed him faster than I could." The room was silent save for the scrape of the inspector's pen. Miss Marple watched Edward with unblinking eyes, her expression unreadable. "You see," Edward whispered, "it was not murder. Not entirely. A plan, yes, born of desperation and anger, but I never meant the fall to be fatal. I only wished him to fear, to remember I still existed." Graves's tone was ice. "And yet he died, and you hid the glove, wiped the railing, concealed the truth. That is guilt, Mr. Ashworth." Edward's eyes filled with tears he refused to shed. Yes, he said. I concealed it because I was terrified. The family already despised me. They would have rejoiced to see me hang. So I buried the truth behind silence. But silence grows heavier, and tonight I cannot bear it any longer. Miss Marple finally spoke, her voice quiet but piercing. Edward, you may believe it was not murder, but your intent speaks for itself. You created fear, you staged darkness, you weakened the stair with wax. That is premeditation, even if you did not strike the final blow. And somewhere in your heart, you knew that if Sir Reginald fell, your troubles would vanish with him. Her words hung in the air like a verdict. Edward bowed his head, shoulders trembling. Graves shut his notebook with a snap. We have what we need. The details match the physical evidence. The wax, the glove, the scratches. Your confession will stand. He rose from the table. Edward Ashworth, you will be held for the murder of Sir Reginald Fairfax. Edward slumped back in his chair, as though the very marrow had been drained from his bones. His lips parted once more. I did not want it, but perhaps it was inevitable. He held us all in chains, and I was too weak to break free without destroying him. Miss Marple regarded him with pity rather than triumph. Weakness often dresses itself in clever disguises, Edward, but truth strips them away. You must face what you've done. The lantern's light guttered as if echoing the finality of her words. Chapter 8, The Interrogation and Confession. Part 3-3, The Lies Exposed and the Final Collapse. The room held its silence, but Miss Marple's eyes had not softened. She leaned slightly forward, knitting needles idle in her lap, her gaze resting steadily on Edward Ashworth. You have told us much, she began gently, but not everything. There is still a thread out of place in your story. Edward blinked at her, his shoulders sagging in exhaustion. I have confessed, haven't I? What more do you want? I told you about the candle, the wax, the glove. Isn't that enough? Miss Marple's voice remained mild, but her words sharpened like a needle. Enough for guilt, yes, but not for truth. You would have us believe it was an accident of wax and shadows, that Sir Reginald's fall was chance. Yet there is one thing you cannot explain, the scratch upon the banister. Edward's breath caught. You see, Miss Marple continued, the marks were not caused by Sir Reginald's frantic grip as he fell. They were deeper, sharper, carved by something harder than fingernails. A ring, perhaps, a family ring, clutched in anger while he was forced downward. Inspector Graves straightened, his eyes narrowing on Edward. Are you saying he didn't just stumble? Edward's hands curled into fists. His lips parted, then closed again. Finally, he whispered, I tried to stop him leaving. He was shouting, threatening to cast me out, to name me a disgrace before the entire family. I held him. My hand pressed against his shoulder, forcing him back. But he resisted, stronger than I expected. Miss Marple's tone was quiet but firm. And in that struggle, Edward, you pushed harder than you meant. It was no longer only wax and darkness. It was force. And that makes all the difference. Edward's voice broke. I swear I didn't mean to kill him. His cry echoed in the cellar, bouncing off the stone walls like a lament. I only wanted him to hear me, to give me a chance. But his foot slipped, and my hand did not let go soon enough. Graves slammed his notebook shut again, this time like a gavel. That's enough. You admit it now. It was not an accident. It was not fate. It was your own doing. The weight of finality pressed over Edward, and he sank lower in his chair, his body slack with defeat. The flicker of hope that his story might win pity had burned out. He looked suddenly older, worn thin by guilt that could no longer be hidden behind words. Lady Eleanor, who had listened in stony silence, let out a sharp, strangled breath. You fool, she whispered, trembling. You've destroyed us all. But Miss Marple lifted a hand, her voice unexpectedly gentle. No, Lady Eleanor, it was not Edward alone who destroyed this family. It was pride, greed, and silence, each of you bearing some share. Sir Reginald's will, Edward's debts, Charles's ambition, Beatrice's secrets, all these threads knotted together. Murder rarely comes from one reason alone. Edward's eyes lifted to her, hollow and resigned. Then what am I now? A murderer? Condemned? Miss Marple met his gaze with compassion that held no illusion. You are a man who made a choice in anger, and anger is the cruelest of masters. The law will call you a murderer, and rightly so. But the truth of your weakness, that lies in your own heart, and you must carry it. Graves gestured to his constables. Take him. The scrape of boots echoed as Edward was lifted from his chair. He did not resist. His head bowed, his lips moving silently, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in regret. The clank of the cellar door closing behind him was like the tolling of a funeral bell. When silence returned, Lady Eleanor sank into her seat, her hands trembling in her lap. Charles muttered curses under his breath, while Beatrice stared at the floor, her pale face unreadable. Only Miss Marple remained steady, her eyes on the guttering lantern flame. It is over, she said softly, but not forgotten. Remember this night. Secrets, when hidden, do not sleep. They wait, and they grow sharp in the dark. The others shivered at her words. Outside, the wind howled through the trees of Netherfield, carrying with it the weight of all that had been spoken and all that could never be undone. Chapter 9, Epilogue, The Cromwell Letter Secret. 3 mornings after Edward Ashworth was taken away, the rain at last abandoned Netherfield. Pale sunlight spilled through the tall library windows as if testing whether the house would accept warmth again. The room had been set to order. The ladder righted, the spiral stair polished, the grandfather clock ticking with the modest pride of a thing repaired. Only the darker sheen along the oak banister, where a ring had bitten grain, hinted that time here would never quite run as it had before. Miss Marple arrived with her small handbag and an expression that suggested neither triumph nor sorrow, only a patient readiness to tidy up the last loose threads. Inspector Graves met her at the threshold. Paperwork, he said with a sigh, tapping a folder under his arm. Statements, custody chain, the inquest schedule. Grim but necessary. I thought you'd like to know. Edward has retained counsel and has not recanted. Miss Marple inclined her head. Truth seldom finds a shorter road once it's chosen its way. She glanced past him to the shelves. Lady Eleanor asked me to look over Sir Reginald's private papers before the solicitors cart them off. She is concerned about what may lie in them, and what should not. Graves managed a faint smile. If there is a thorn among the roses, you'll find it. Lady Eleanor awaited them at Sir Reginald's desk, its leather top cleared with the tidiness of a battlefield after flags are lowered. Her composure was back in place. Grief had withdrawn into lines at the corners of her eyes. There is a cupboard, she said, gesturing to the wainscoting behind the desk. Reginald always kept it locked. The key is not among his things. We tried my set and the house set, neither will oblige. If there is anything unpleasant, I would prefer it be discovered by the right hands. The right hands, Inspector Graves murmured, are presently gloved, but second best, I suppose, will do. He nodded at Miss Marple. She stepped closer to the paneling. The varnish was dull where fingers had often strayed. On the shelf above, the half-pulled volume Miss Marple had noticed on the first day, Icon Basilic, now sat flush with its neighbors. She slid it out again, slowly. A strand of horsehair brushed her palm. Curious, she said softly. Bookbinders sometimes used horsehair in padding spines. This, however, has been left intentionally proud. She turned the book on its edge. A shallow brass pin, nearly invisible against the gilt, protruded a nail's breadth from the backboard. Miss Marple depressed it with a knitting needle from her bag. Somewhere inside the paneling, a spring gave a discreet click. A narrow door popped forward the width of a coin. Lady Eleanor exhaled. Good heavens! Behind the panel lay a small recess, no larger than a pastry tin. Within it, wrapped in oilcloth gone amber with age, lay a leather cylinder and a sealed envelope, the wax stamped with the Fairfax crest. Graves took an involuntary step forward, then stopped himself and looked to Miss Marple. She nodded once. He lifted both items as if they had the weight of verdicts. "The cylinder first," Miss Marple suggested. "Sometimes the future is easier to bear if the past speaks plainly." Graves untied the twine, eased free a tight-rolled parchment, and laid it on the desk. The script was cramped, brown with centuries, the hand of a man who wrote swiftly and without apology. At the bottom, bold as a banner, was a name that pulled the air from the room. "Oliver Cromwell," Lady Eleanor whispered. The syllables fell with the awe reserved for saints or executioners, depending on one's parish. Graves read aloud, haltingly at first, then with a steady cadence. "To Sir Thomas Fairfax of Netherfield, news reaches me of unquiet in Kent. Your duty is to the peace of this good nation, not to the humors of those who would raise it to tumult. Stand firm. If your neighbors complain, remind them, mercy without order fattens rebellion. God prosper your hand. O.C." A silence followed, the kind that is made heavier by human hearts weighing two truths at once, the glitter of historical importance and the grit of what it implies. Miss Marple traced, not the ink, but the margin, where a later Fairfax had penned a neat note in faded blue. "Kept as charge and as shame." She looked up. "Sir Reginald found it, I think, and read not only Cromwell's vigor but his own family's reflection in it. Firmness become hardness, order mistaken for righteousness, choices made that cost other men their peace." Lady Eleanor's eyes shone. "He said in his last months that the house carried a debt. Not on paper, he called it, but in the marrow. He burned 2 old ledgers after supper one evening. I scolded him for it." Graves cleared his throat and tapped the sealed envelope. "And this?" Miss Marple gestured that he should open it. The wax cracked like thin ice. Inside lay 2 sheets. The first, a codicil drafted but unsigned. The second, a letter in Sir Reginald's square, soldierly hand. Graves skimmed the legal page. He intended to alter the will, substantially. A trust for the hospital at Much Benham, the school roof, the poor parish widows. Less to the family, though not nothing. Lady Eleanor nodded slowly. "He spoke of it. We argued. I told him charity begins at home. He answered, 'Sometimes, my dear, home is where we have taken too much.'" Miss Marple lifted the personal letter and, with Lady Eleanor's permission, read quietly until the paper trembled once between her fingers. She passed it to Lady Eleanor, who read aloud in a voice that broke and mended as the lines required. "Eleanor, if I do not sign in time, forgive me. I have delayed out of cowardice and hope, cowardice that I might be loved without displeasing, hope that my children would meet duty halfway. If the papers are not in order, I beg you to do what I could not finish. Pay back what our name took lightly. Let Charles be free of my severity, Beatrice of my silence, Edward of my disappointment. Tell them I loved them badly, but I loved them still. R." The last initial sat alone, a small dark square that felt more human than any flourish. For a long moment, no one spoke. The clock gave a patient tick, as if marking not seconds, but the restitching of a fabric frayed by years. Inspector Graves folded the codicil. Unsigned, but clear in intention. "A court will see the letters you found in the desk, Miss Marple, and this. It may not bind the will, but it binds decency. What the law cannot compel, conscience may." Lady Eleanor set the letter down with both hands as one lays a flower. "Conscience will," she said simply. "We will honor it. The hospital, the school, the widows. Charles will bluster, Beatrice will cry, and both will survive. It is time we paid the marrow debt." "And the Cromwell letter?" Graves asked. "It belongs in a vault, or a museum." Miss Marple's eyes warmed. "In the nation's keeping, I should think. Let learned people quarrel over the footnotes. The village will be content knowing something harsh and honest left this room and became history, not secret." Lady Eleanor squared her shoulders. "I will write to the British Library myself, with a copy of my husband's letter enclosed." Graves looked to Miss Marple. "One wonders, Miss Marple, whether discovering this earlier would have changed anything." Miss Marple smoothed a fold in her glove. "We save the peace we can, Inspector. Sir Reginald could not be kept from his fall. But his last wish can be kept from a different kind of falling away. The kind that lets a family believe itself poor when it is only ungenerous." The inspector nodded, oddly comforted. "You have a way of making endings behave." "Not endings," she said, smiling faintly. "Continuations with more light." They replaced the panel, not to hide, but to mark the place where secrets had been stored and, at last, spent. When they stepped into the corridor, Beatrice was waiting, hands clutched, eyes searching faces for doom or reprieve. Miss Marple took her gently by the arm. "Your father asked to set certain things right," she said. "You have the chance to help him do it." Beatrice blinked hard and nodded, as if accepting a task on the first day of a new term. Charles, encountered later in the courtyard, huffed and sputtered and, after one attempt at indignation, subsided into a quieter sort of resolve. People are surprisingly good at doing the decent thing once they have been deprived of excuses. By afternoon, white sheets trembled on lines in the servants' yard, and the house absurdly smelt of soap. Mrs. Dunlop supervised with a vigor that dared anyone to mistake domestic order for moral clarity again. Miss Marple took her leave at the gate where the lane gathered hedges and gossip. The sky was the color of honest linen. Lady Eleanor walked beside her a few steps. "I misjudged you," Lady Eleanor said. "I thought you came for curiosities. You came for the truth, and left us some to live by." She pressed a small parcel into Miss Marple's hand. A slender volume of poems once kept in the library, its flyleaf inscribed with a Fairfax motto in Latin that meant, more or less, "We mend where we have torn." On her way back to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple paused on the ridge where one can see the church tower, the mill stream, and a great many garden sins with equal clarity. The wind lifted the hedgerows into a soft applause. A bicycling telegraph boy wobbled past, cap askew, and called, "Afternoon, Miss Marple. Post for you tomorrow, urgent from the north, they say." She smiled, unsurprised. The world, having been set a little straighter in one place, had discovered a fresh slant in another. She walked on, thinking of codicils and candles, of letters that arrive late and are nonetheless in time, and of how often wickedness is only weakness wearing good shoes. Back in her cottage, she set the Fairfax parcel on the mantel and put the kettle on. Outside, the weather settled. Inside, peace arranged itself sensibly on chairbacks and windowsills. And in some careful archive in London, a clerk would soon receive a leather cylinder and wonder, briefly, what quiet small woman had insisted that a nation be given one more chance to remember itself accurately.